Good afternoon. And thank you, Daniel, for your introduction. It's great to be here. In actual fact, it seems that many people have come here because they're interested in how can I live life to the fullest. Particularly, that's impressive because it's a beautiful weekend afternoon on the Gold Coast with the sun out. But we're going to be dealing with what I think is some really important information. Just a couple of things before I do start. First of all, I like to be interactive, so there'll be times when I'll be asking the group various questions. And the other thing, and I guess this is the usual disclaimer that medical people have to do, that the material which I'm presenting is of a general nature, and if there are specific things that you're thinking of to apply to yourself, it's always good to get the advice of a health professional to see if it applies directly to your circumstance. Well, the first question which I want to ask is, and before we get to or introducing the topic of the power of the mind, that is, what is health? We've come here because we're interested in health, but what is it what are we talking about when we're asking this question, what is health? Okay, a sense of well-being. Yeah, well-being is a word that's often used and a good word. Vitality, yeah. And vitality is one of those really positive words that is more than just an absence of disease. I think it's a matter of kind of looking at the best in health, the optimal, having that energy there. What are the type of things that we're looking for in health? Okay, feeling good, feeling well. Energy, yeah.
Free of illnesses.
Yeah, free of illnesses, and aren't we seeing more illnesses as I guess the decades roll on? It's we're seeing an epidemic of chronic illness. Yeah. Fitness? Yeah, fitness is another thing that we associate with health. So, as you can see, there are many different ideas that relate to health and actually impact on health. But the thing is, we often think of physical health when we think of health, but it's often something that, well, really, it's a lot more than just physical health. Because there's a mental health. We know that mental health or mental disease is a major impact on the community around. The figures are that at least 20% of the population will at some stage suffer depression in their lifetime. And there's other types of mental disease and indeed a big burden of illness because of mental health issues. And we'll touch on more of that in a little while. What about social health? What we're recognising is the interrelationships that we have, the connectedness that we have with other people is actually critical when it comes to impacting on the other areas of health. And then, of course, spiritual health is one of those concepts that I think we're only just becoming to recognise in the academic literature. In the last decade or two, there have been increasing numbers of studies that have addressed spiritual health and actually spiritual concepts and their interaction and their impact on physical, mental and social health. And it seems that this is a major dimension which sometimes we don't actually think of when we look at health as well. And so they are some themes which we'll keep returning to over the next 2 weeks as well. But this actually then touches on another question, that is, what is the purpose of health? And I think as we've discussed it just a few minutes ago, I think it's actually quite obvious that health is not just a single purpose. I think we've touched on the concept of optimal functioning. And sure, we can think of the body as being made up of trillions of cells, and cellular health is something which is vital, and we need it for optimal functioning. So if we can have our cells functioning at an optimal level, well, guess what? Our entire organism and being is also going to function at a much better level. And so what we want to achieve with health is optimal functioning. But what are some of the other things that we want to achieve in terms of purposes of health? Any ideas?
Fulfillment.
Yeah, fulfillment. Okay, so that's going at a level more than just the physical, isn't it? So fulfillment, I think, is an important one. Longer life or longevity, yeah. That's a big one. We'll come to that in a moment. Quality of life. So not only longevity of life, but people want to actually have quality of life as well. And so, absolutely, these are all powerful and important concepts. So, wellness has been mentioned before. Longevity has just been mentioned. Longevity is an interesting one. What we're noticing is that the lifespans have certainly been increasing over the last 100 years or so. The problem is that with some of the lifestyle illnesses that we're seeing now, there are many experts who are looking at it and saying, look, the current generation may well not live as long as their parents. It may be the first generation in a very long time that will happen, which is very sad. There are other people, though, who are looking at the potential advances in medicine and saying, well, hang on a minute, maybe there is great hope. One person who some of you may have heard of is a futurist by the name of Ray Kurzweil. He studies trends and tries to predict what the future may be. And he's actually very excited about the prospect in medicine and in longevity. And so his view is, and he expressed this several years ago, he said that if he can just make it to the year 2030, which I guess is only 15 more years, he believes that the advances in medicine will be such that it will be able to extend his lifespan by a further 10 years. In that 10 years, the advances in medicine will be such that there'll be further extension available. And so he and others are actually saying, well, if we can just look after ourselves now and wait for the next 10, 20, 30 years, maybe, in fact, hopefully, they're saying there'll be an opportunity that we could well live to a very old age. I guess time will tell if they're right, but there's a certain optimism around there with longevity. So for those who want to strive for that, well, it does make sense to try to make sure we're in the best of health that we can now to maybe avail ourselves of that opportunity down the track. But then these first three deal with, I guess, the physical organism to some extent and does touch on other concepts. But what about the capacity to contribute? And I think this touches on the point of fulfillment that was mentioned before. The capacity to contribute and also to pursue meaning. And so this is an aspect of health we don't often think about, but it's more than just the physical or the mental or the social or the spiritual in isolation. It's when we put the total package together, I think that there are purposes of health that can make a huge difference in terms of not only our quality of life, our longevity of life, but also the meaning and purpose and the fulfillment that we have now and going to the future. And I think that's the background to what is really total health, and that's what we want to be talking about over these next 6 sessions. Well, when we actually look at the last one, you can see actually the last two, the mind is something that is very important to actually be part of that. If we're making a contribution, if we're pursuing meaning, those aspects require the mind. And so it's worthwhile making a few comments on the importance of the mind. Now, the mind is something a little bit different to just the brain. The brain obviously is a physical organ which is contained within our skull. And we can describe its workings very well, or we're increasingly able to describe it by neuroscience and neurotransmitters and examining the neurons and the biochemistry. And that's very important. We're getting more and more understanding of that. But the thing is, the mind-body problem, as it's known in philosophy and other studies, is something that is still many people are grappling with. What is the relationship between the mind and the body, or the mind and the brain? See, with the mind, we can actually make plans. We can put our plans into action. We can remember things. We can act intentionally. We can make choices. We can have free will. And so these are all concepts that are related to the mind, and in fact are very significant when it comes not only to its relationship with the brain, but also with the body and also with total health, as we'll see in a moment. See, there's a strong relationship between the mind and the body. We've known that, and we're increasingly knowing that. In fact, there are medical journals which deal with this, with mind-body medicine. There's a journal dealing, or many journals dealing with psychoneuroimmunology. So basically the mind and the nervous system and the immune system. We know that one aspect will affect another aspect. And so this is where it's actually critical to understand the power of the mind. In recent years, there's been a new I guess science should call it, a sub-science called epigenetics. How many people have heard of epigenetics? Okay, yeah, look, probably half, just over half of the room. In about half a century ago, DNA, the structure of it was worked out, and so there was great excitement because we understood that DNA was the critical part of the cell that determined the function of the cell, and in fact determined the function of the body as well, as we then understood it. And so it took many years, in fact it took till approximately the year 2000 for the Human Genome Project to actually work out the human DNA structure. So they're able to work out all the different genes, all the different structure, and at that stage it was thought, fantastic. We can actually then look at genetic predispositions that we have, and we can actually solve the problem of various diseases. And it was supposed to be a great big milestone that we would go a great way towards curing many of the illnesses that we have in society. But what was found was that maybe that thinking was a little bit premature. Because the thought was that if you had DNA as being what you inherited, that determined your fate and that determined your future. And the problem, excuse me, the problem with that was that we found that that wasn't the case. There was an interesting experiment done some years ago with bacteria, but these were particular bacteria that could not produce the enzyme lactase. Now, some of you will know that lactase is important to breaking down a milk sugar called lactose. And there are people who, if they don't have that enzyme or not sufficient of that enzyme, then various dairy and milk products can't be broken down, and so they get uncomfortable symptoms. Well, these particular bacteria were put into a petri dish, and they were given food, but the only food that they were given was the lactose, was the milk sugar. And so what would you expect would happen if that was the case? Well, they would die, because they can't produce the enzyme to break down the sugar to use it for food, and so you would expect that that bacteria would die. Well, guess what? They looked at the petri dish 3 days later, and guess what they found? They found a whole multiplication of bacteria. Now, how was that? Now, of course, if you're a medical researcher, one of the first things you think of, well, could this be contaminated? Well, guess what? They repeated the experiment. In fact, other laboratories have since repeated the experiment and found that this is actually the case. And what this actually turned on the head was the idea that all the information was stored in the DNA and then was transmitted to the rest of the cell, and everything was based on the DNA. This actually demonstrated that information can flow the other way and actually impact the DNA, which was actually revolutionary. Now, epigenetics is the study of the influences which sit above the DNA, which interestingly can impact the DNA. See, many of us were brought up to believe that the DNA that you inherited, the genetic information that you inherited from your parents, was it. That sealed your fate. If you had a strong family history of be it heart disease or cancer, whatever it was, well, guess what? You were in the firing line, and look, bad luck, that was just it. Your genes determined your fate. Well, what we're finding now that that's not exactly the case. Because of this epigenetics, there are these influences in the environment that can impact on the DNA and its expression. And so what we find is, yes, you are born with a certain DNA. It is actually then switched on to program in a particular way. But what we know is that environment can influence the DNA in a way that certain genes will be switched on and other ones will be switched off, different to the way that you were born with those switches. Now, that's actually very exciting, because it means that if you have a predisposition or a family history of heart disease or cancer or many other chronic diseases, guess what? By appropriate lifestyle intervention, you can have a big impact on the way that your genome or DNA is expressed. It means that we actually have enormous capacity to overcome whatever family history we have in the vast majority of cases, and that's something that's very empowering. Now, what is interesting, I think particularly, and it goes further, is the power of the mind. Because if certain lifestyle habits or issues can make an impact on our DNA. And here, look, some of the obvious ones would be things like diet, exercise, getting enough sleep, etc., etc. What about our minds? Can our minds impact our DNA? An exciting answer is yes. That our thoughts and our emotions can impact the expression of our own DNA. And so we know that positive emotions will turn the switches in a way which is positive and conducive for health. So positive emotions. What are some positive emotions that you can tell me? Okay, love, happiness, joy, peace. Yeah, so these are some of the emotions, and the interesting thing is that when we have that mindset or when we have that attitude or express those emotions, those things impact directly onto our physical health and our emotional health, which is a revolution that we're only just starting to understand in the last decade or so as we look at this science of epigenetics. Now, what's the flip side of that? What are some negative emotions? Okay. Hatred, revenge, I guess, envy, jealousy, anger, and particularly, I guess, even some of the repressed anger, we're finding out, it can be very damaging, etc. So some of these negative emotions, in fact, these negative emotions have the exact opposite. They will switch on genes which are detrimental to our health and switch off the protective ones. Now, how critical is that? It kind of puts a whole new perspective on the way that we approach life and our attitude to life and the way that we interact with other people. You can see now why, as we're looking at this paradigm of total health, which looks at the spiritual, mental, physical, mental, social and spiritual, then all these factors can be interrelated. And so it's very dangerous just to look at one in isolation and think that's all we've got to do for good health. As so often, as a society, we just look at the physical aspect of health and stop there. That's why the others are just so important. In fact, there was some ancient writing some 2,000 or more years ago, which actually says exactly this. When we look at the Bible, and one of the writings by the Apostle Paul in the book of Galatians, he talks about these positive emotions. He says, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. So what we're understanding now, some 2,000 years later, is that these things which are pointed out as being highly virtuous and highly desirable actually have a major impact on our physical health as well. And it's interesting, there's a passage also in Romans 12 in the Bible, and it says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And this is what we're actually understanding more of today, is that we can have major health effects from a transformation or from the renewing of our minds. Now, I want to make a few comments about the power of gratitude. Gratitude is one of those things, I guess, we all know deep down is something that we probably should express, but it's surprising how many people don't. In my practice, I obviously meet many people and many people who suffer from depression. And it's surprising how often those who actually are depressed find that there's very little that they think that there is to be grateful about. And I found this again and again. One of the exercises I will often ask my patients to do when they come in with depression is say, well, look, for the next week, I want you every day to write down 3 things, on a piece of paper or a notebook or wherever on your computer. Write down 3 things for which you're grateful. And the next day, review those 3 things and add 3 more. And keep doing that every day, review the entire list and add 3 more. And after a week, they have 21 things on the list. And they're reviewing them every day, and so it can continue forwards. What is very interesting is that many people have said, when I see them again in a week or 2 time after that, they say that has made a major impact. As I started looking at those things and reflecting on those things, I found that life was actually not so bad as I thought it was. I found that there was something deeper, there was something more, and hey, it's actually made a big impact on my thinking and the way I feel. So the power of gratitude is actually something which is which can be very powerful. And I think we're understanding a little bit about that with the epigenetics, because depression is something that is multifactorial. We know that there's a lot of different influences to that, but as we express gratitude, we are actually impacting the expression of our genetics as well. And so that can be impacting some of the biochemical processes that we know can be behind the pathology of depression. Now, I want to just comment briefly, or ask actually the question briefly, well, what are some of the effects that lifestyle can have on mental health? So what are some of the things that you know that in lifestyle that can have an effect on the way that our minds work?
Exercise.
Sure, exercise? Yeah, or lack of exercise. Yes, diet, exercise? Sleep? Sunlight? Yeah. Fresh air? Hydration. Absolutely. No, these are some of the very important effects of lifestyle, and they all make a big difference not only on physical health, but they also make a big difference on mental health.
Television.
Sorry, what was that?
Television.
Yeah, television, absolutely, in terms of a lifestyle effect, because not only in terms of, I guess, maybe the content that goes in there, so, you know, some of it which I guess is debatable, but you know, most people are sitting while they're watching television, they're probably eating some of the foods, not necessarily the good foods, while they're watching television, so and probably losing sleep in many cases. So you're quite right, television. Yeah.
And they're not socially interacting with other people while they're watching television.
Well, that's true too, yeah. Socially, it's one thing, I guess, to watch with a group, but you're not generally interacting a lot while you're all glued to the television watching the television. So quite right. So the question is, how can we optimise the health of the mind? And I just want to run through a few points. In fact, you've already touched on a lot of them, so you know, you're obviously a very switched on group, which is fantastic. Well, the first one is attitude, and we've already touched on epigenetics and how important that is for the health of the mind. The positive emotions can actually lead to things like gratitude and joy and peace and love. All those things can transform our genetic expression and our physical health for the positive. On the negative side, if we have negative emotions, we know that it does have an impact. Now, you think of those negative emotions that we mentioned. In most cases, they will increase the stress levels that we feel. Once we increase stress levels, we're going to find we deplete other nutrients. So it's going to affect, in many cases, our immune systems. It will affect our neurotransmitter balance that we have in our brains. In fact, it can interfere with the length of what we call telomeres in each cell. Now, some of you will know that telomeres are those strands that each cell has, and every time a cell divides, it loses just a tiny snippet at the end of these things called telomeres. Think of it in terms of, let's say, a shoelace, you know, with that tiny plastic bit at the end. And so a little bit, every time the cell divides, a little snip gets cut off, and so over time, as you age, they get shorter and shorter. What we know is that negative emotions and the stress that results from that accelerates that shortening of the telomeres. And that's, I guess, a scary thought, but try not to be scared too long. Try to counter that by having the positive, the positive emotions. So attitude can actually make a big difference when it comes not only to the health of our mind, but also longevity. The next one, which was mentioned, was exercise. I tend to use the word activity simply because I don't know about you, but a lot of people I speak to, as soon as you mention the word exercise, they have these bad feelings. Too many people, I think, have these visions of people, fitted out in this expensive gear, paying an expensive membership to some facility where they go maybe 2 or 3 times and then pay for the rest of the year. Been there, done that, I must confess. But activity is, and it's not just, half killing yourself in a Gold Coast marathon, although I'm not necessarily going to argue against that if you're so inclined, but I'm not saying we all need to do that. In terms of activity, what we're finding is the real killer is inactivity. And you may have heard the expression that sitting is the new smoking. And what we're finding is that those people who particularly, sit all day at their jobs, the negative health effects are just massive, including on the health of the mind. See, activity is something, or exercise, if I dare use that word, is something that stimulates a lot of positivity. There was a study done some years ago comparing regular mild to moderate exercise. So for example, walking 30 or 40 minutes a week, 30 or 40 minutes per day, 3 or 4 times a week. And they compared it with one of the leading antidepressants. You know what they found? They found that after 6 weeks, the mild to moderate exercise program had as good an effect as taking a full-on antidepressant for depression. So I don't know about you, but I'd rather do the exercise than take an antidepressant, particularly when you consider the long list of side effects that are possible with antidepressants. Exercise also impacts so many other positive things in the body as well. There was also a study done some years ago which looked at people in nursing homes who had mild to moderate dementia. And they found that if they were put on an exercise program, and sometimes it was a fairly basic exercise program, it actually did a lot to slow the progression of that dementia in the nursing homes. So we know that the activity can have a big impact. See, what it does, it can impact directly on neurotransmitter levels. It can impact on oxygenation to the brain. And it basically can make a huge difference in the functioning of it, such that we would wonder why exercise isn't something that we all do more of, or at least do more activity. Because we know, in fact, there are some anti-aging researchers who basically say, if you do nothing else, exercise is the number one thing that you've got to do in order to help with the aging process or to help slow it down. Next one, sunlight, which was also mentioned before. Sunlight's an interesting one because we have a bit of an aversion to the sun. We've been having messages for the last 30 or 40 years saying, be careful of the sun. That's fair enough, because we know that if we have too much sun, and particularly if we have too much sunburn, we increase the risk of skin cancers, particularly melanoma, which can be deadly, of course. But the flip side of that is that we've got a whole population now which is increasingly tending towards vitamin D deficiency. And we know that vitamin D is important in regulating many hundreds of different reactions in the body. We also know that sunlight can help set the circadian rhythms and the body clock. And that has a major impact in terms of mental health and depression. You may have heard of seasonal affective disorder, where, and this is particularly bad in some of the northern European countries where they have a very long winter, and people will tend to get depressed. And why is that? It tends to be because of lack of sunlight, and many postulate it could be because of lack of vitamin D as well. So sunlight is something which actually is positive. I don't know how you feel on a bright sunny day compared to one which, you know what it's like when it's been raining and overcast for 3 or 4 or 5 days? I mean, you just tend to feel a little bit maybe more gloomy than if it was sunshine. Maybe it's just me, but look, I suspect a lot of you have felt the same as well. The next thing is sleep. Sleep was mentioned. Ideally, we want to aim as close to 7 or 8 hours as we possibly can. We have a society which has an epidemic of not enough sleep. I guess we've got so many pressures, we're all so busy. The thing is that with sleep, our bodies detox during sleep. In fact, our bodies, we deal with memory. We also deal with, I guess you could say, emotional health during time of sleep. And the problem is that if we're sleep deprived, our emotional health suffers because we're not able to actually balance the neurotransmitters, we're not able to actually balance the chemicals there. See, during sleep there's melatonin which is produced. It's a chemical you may have heard of. Melatonin is also anti-aging. Growth hormone is produced while we sleep. Growth hormone is important for so many different functions of the body as well. But what's been found only just very recently is there's a whole process in the brain that detoxes during sleep. See, the brain doesn't have a lymphatic system like the rest of the body, and so somehow the toxins have to come out. Well, how do the toxins come out? What we've found is there's a system which some have labelled the glymphatic system, because the structure in the brain is made up of cells called glioma cells. And When we sleep, the brain cells themselves actually shrink. And there are channels where the cerebrospinal fluid flows through the brain and actually helps to eliminate the waste and toxins. And this is a process which is 10 times more effective during sleep than when you're awake. And so this is one of the dangers of actually not having enough sleep, is that if you are chronically sleep deprived, then you're just not giving your brain the opportunity, well, to deal with memory issues and others, but particularly the detox. And over time that can build up. Interestingly, when these channels open, it can eliminate compounds even like the beta amyloid, which we know that if it accumulates is one of the things associated with Alzheimer's, for example. So this is a very new but fascinating area of research. Nutrition. We're going to spend a whole session on nutrition tomorrow, so I don't want to labour it too much. But one of the things that I ask, when I have a patient who comes in for depressed, for example, we've talked about gratitude. I will encourage them to have an exercise program or activity program, and then we speak about nutrition. In terms of neurotransmitter synthesis, we know that there are certain cofactors or building blocks that are critical. We need to have enough protein in the right form of protein. We need to have zinc. It's involved in 2 steps of the process. We need to have magnesium. We need to have iron. We need to have vitamin B6, also involved in 2 stages of the process. Now, we'll talk more about this tomorrow, but the problem is that our diets too often are deficient in many of these compounds. And by making sure that we are sufficient in those, in fact, even better, sufficient is optimal, then we can go a long way to impacting the health of our brain, but also impacting our total body health as well. Then we have relationships. Now, relationships are something, well, have you ever thought of what it would be like to be the only person alive on Earth? I don't know, that's something that I guess over the years occasionally my mind has wandered, thinking, well, look, what if I was the only one here and all these different experiences and, the wonderful, things we can see in nature, etc., but you were the only one to enjoy it. It'd be quite a depressing thought after a while. And that's the thing, we're actually built for relationships. When we look at it from a spiritual sense, there's a certain connectedness that we are designed for. And what we want to do is to optimize those relationships and the positive emotions that can be associated with those relationships. Because as a result of that, then we are much more fulfilled, and our health in its total capacity is something which is greatly enhanced. And then we've got the whole topic of faith and purpose. And that is, and this is something we'll talk about later as well, but what we're finding is, the research is coming out very clearly that having a faith-based dimension to life, those who have such a dimension, they have decreased depression. If they have depression, they recover faster from depression. There's less anxiety, there's less suicide, there's more hope, optimism, purpose. These are some of the things which are in the peer-reviewed literature which are coming out now, and something which we will deal with as well. So as you can see here, there are some very simple but very effective steps that can make a huge difference to the effectiveness and the power of our mind. And as we've seen, our mind is very powerful indeed, because it is through the way that we think and the emotions that we feel that we can impact our total physical health, our genetic expression, and the way that our total health actually comes together. So I wish you all the best with the power of the mind.